Welcome to Sarat Samvad, an initiative from Border Studies in South Asia. Our guest for today is Dr. Mirza Zulfiqur Rahman. Now, Dr. Mirza holds a PhD in Development Studies from Indian Institute of Technology, which is located in Guwahati in Assam, India. He is currently a visiting associate fellow at Institute of Chinese Studies, which is located in Delhi. Dr. Mirza's research specialization is on border studies and on transboundary water sharing and management. He has traveled extensively in northeast part of India for both personal and for research fieldwork, in particular to India's northeast borderlands with China, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. He has published extensively on these related issues, which we would be discussing within this interaction. Now, thank you, Dr. Mirza, for joining us for this interaction. And our first question for you is you have both the unique experience of analyzing and traveling the northeastern borders of India, both as an academic for fieldwork and as a resident traveling those border regions. Can you please share with us your experience in viewing the same region through different lenses?
Thank you so much, Ankur, for inviting me to be part of this innovative series called Sarhad Samvad, and focusing also on South Asia particularly. I have been engaged in research in Northeast India for the past 15 years, and I have never felt a distinction between being a resident of the region and an academic traveling for fieldwork. This basically, I think, is to my mind to do with the methodological approach that I've been able to follow of being a participant observer, and based on my core understanding and priorities of community engagement in these borderlands. Um, I bring forward my field impressions from these borderlands from the perspective of being from the region, um, and lived experiences through my long years of travels and multiple travels through these borderlands. Um, and I've not only traveled in Northeast India, but also in neighboring countries of not like India, such as Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, China, and in Nepal. So in that context, I've been also been able to weave my positionality of being from the region in Northeast India's perspective in an effective and impactful manner into my research writings, and frame them within the broad context of alternative understandings and perceptions that borderland communities have of the borders, of the lines, the fences, um, which we normally think about in terms of borders, and the transboundary political and ecological spaces in the larger borderlands encompassing Northeast India. So the lens that through which I view the region is different from the definitely the strategic narrow understanding of Northeast India as an administrative category within the nation state of India, something that the political scientist Sanjeev Barua also calls it as a directional category, administrative category and a directional category. To my mind, in order to understand Northeast India from a border studies perspective, as this podcast is also focusing upon, we need to have a holistic understanding of the history, of the geography of the larger transboundary spaces and the transboundary communities inhabiting them. And that will involve encompassing the larger international neighborhood as well. There are multiple lenses through which this borderland is perceived. And from strategic imaginations of the nation state, that is one lens that this borderland is perceived, to the socio-cultural and ecological imaginations and worldviews, the alternative worldviews that I was talking about, of the borderland communities. And in this intersection of these different worldviews, and of the plurality of these perceptions that I base my research work upon. My disciplinary background is political science and international relations, and I come from that background. However, when after I have started working in this region on border studies in Northeast India and the surrounding neighborhood, my research work in the region has taken a multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary framing over the past many years. So that by itself is a bearing upon as to how we as practitioners and scholars of border studies in the region also have to take a more interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary focus and not only remain limited to our disciplinary borders, so to say. The 8 states of Northeast India, just to give a background to the audience, in a sense, the Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, and Sikkim. These 8 states share its administrative and political borders with Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Myanmar, and Nepal. It is a site of long-standing contestations in the social, political, economic, and development realms in the South Asian and Southeast Asian regional context. Borders and transboundary spaces in Northeast India, therefore, needs to be studied in this context of this larger spatial interconnectedness and development priorities, these trans-regional development priorities that we see. And in the midst of this truly trans-regional context spanning South and Southeast Asia, and not just limited to India or to Northeast India in a sense. The prevailing sense of this social, economic, and political regionalism that we talk about needs to extend to alternative policy, regional, sub-regional, bioregional constructs, which are firmly based on ecological frames of understanding. This is where my research draws upon. With alternative lenses looking at the same borders from a holistic understanding that draws upon history, geography, and the environment, and experiences, the lived experiences, the everyday lives of communities living in this borderland region. Communities inhabiting these transboundary spaces between the high mountains of the relatively younger and almost always crumbling eastern Himalayas and forming, and the rolling hills of the much older and settled Patkai ranges navigate multiple layered political, social, economic, and ecological identities and lived realities and experiences. And this international, regional, sub-regional, say national and transboundary scales overlap across temporalities and a core understanding of such borderland spaces in policy terms needs to be reordered along these lines if we need to make sense of our investigations and research into this into border studies in this region. So to my mind, the natural environment, society, economics, and politics of the geographical space of the eastern Himalayas, the floodplains of the many Himalayan transboundary rivers that nourishes the surrounding foothills needs to be examined outside the nation-state box in the alternative framing of being an eco-region, of being a bioregion. The community imaginations and lived realities of these borderlands are embedded in such alternative frames, which I attempt to unravel through my research engagement across these transboundary spaces. And that has been my attempt over time. So it is important to understand transboundary spaces, as I said, and borders in Northeast India in a larger theoretical framework as well. This theoretical framework will have to span national and regional politics, development policies, social anthropology, migration, rivers, and environment. So this fosters a cross-cultural understanding of borders and spaces within Northeast India in a sub-region, and to bring experience, theory, and knowledge from other borders and spaces of the world. So it's a kind of a cross-cultural conversation in a sense. So in that context, the conversations that occur across these multiple scales and contexts on governance of rivers, for example, forest, land, and ecology in the region, and within the context of environmental democracy, are key to transboundary spaces acquiring social meanings. The intersection of multiple scales across these international, regional, sub-regional, national, provincial, and community level decision-making that I was talking about, and the scales defines this transboundary spatiality in a way, the spatialness and the dimensions of also looking at history, looking at geography. For example, looking at colonial history in these borderlands, as which were kind of looking at as a frontier of resource extraction, followed by post-colonial development discourse over the decades, underlining the transboundary temporalities as well over time. So in order to give you an example from the region, so let us, for example, think of the Sino-Indian borderlands, which straddle across diverse strategic and securitized frames and community worldviews and perceptions. So as one travels from the northernmost borders of Ladakh through Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh, in the easternmost fringes of the Himalayas, there are multiple layers of understanding of these borderlands across spaces, across temporalities. And what we term as the borderlands between modern nation state of China and India, framed in conflict and contestations over, say, territoriality issues and sovereignty claims, intersect multiple scales of community and ecological worldviews and understandings. The forest, the mountains, the rivers, the sacred landscapes of communities who inhabit them, who have shifted along and moved across the Himalayan landscape, formed and crumbling over centuries, characterize the transboundary spaces between China and India. And that is the bioregional framing that I was talking about. The social anthropologist, William Van Sandel, depicts the India-China border as a sensitive border, marked by uncertain sovereignty and apprehensive territoriality, with remarkably frayed edges. So he goes on to argue that a border cannot be, this kind of a border cannot be called a border at all. As in official parlance, it is actually referred to as a line of actual control, and more famously as the McMahon line. So in that sense, he goes on to explain that it is based on the ground presence of the respective militaries along the border, or what is the perception of the borderline by them, usually negotiated on a regular basis by long-range patrols, and kind of in that context, performing area domination exercises and monitoring and inspecting border pillars, and some perhaps doing that only in a year or so, given this remoteness of the borderline. So what William Van Sandel says that the way ahead is to approach such borders across these transboundary spaces from the lens of an anthropology of frayed edges, and then with the definite geography of lines. And I have tried to basically imbibe such a lens of frayed understanding, which basically dissolves my travels in the region for research from an academic point of view, and for my positionality from being from the region, and significantly blurs the border lines, making for a hybrid methodology that I've been following. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mirza, for this answer. Our next question for you is that you have proposed a concept of river regionalism to manage the common river basin interest in South Asia, and as an innovative diplomatic strategy to tackle emerging transboundary water issues in South Asia. Can you please elaborate on this further?
Thank you, Ankur. Yes, if we look at the history of riparian relations in South Asia, it can be termed essentially bilateral in nature. But we notice also a change in the contours of riparian negotiations at the end of the Cold War. The economic interdependencies that have been built around regional and sub-regional institutions and infrastructure development initiatives have pushed countries in the region to think more about how core issues of livelihood, environment and ecological sustainability, and also of shared rivers will fit in the new regimes of regionalism. However, if we look at this, there still seems to be an aversion towards formal treaties governing multilateral engagement on rivers, particularly, for example, between India and China, which are the two major powers in the region. And that explains also the lack of any multilateral treaty on transboundary rivers where either of the countries are signatory in a South Asian perspective. So in a sense, India has no kind of a multilateral kind of a arrangement in South Asia, neither does China. And that also spills over to Bangladesh, Nepal, or any other country in South Asia, for even Pakistan. So the question is, how does these hardened stances can be offsetted to build alternate processes and informal code of conduct, and thereby to bring about a kind of a collective responsibility to a shared transboundary river basin. For example, the Ganges or the Indus or the Brahmaputra river basin. Or the Mahakali, for example. So as India progresses towards a new economic engagement with the world, the issue of water resources and transboundary aspects of water management will definitely come into sharp focus, and the stress of water resources will increase given India's high population and industrial activity. So India definitely has to look at itself as also looking at its a core riparian country. Many of its rivers are shared with Bhutan, Bangladesh, China, Nepal, Pakistan, and this highlights the diplomatic engagement that is required by India with its neighbors relating to this transboundary water sharing and management. So India over time has various tones of overall diplomatic relations and engagement with its neighbors over the past few decades, if you look at it after its independence. And so in these various tones, it is bound to have spillover effects on transboundary water issues in the overall region. So at a time when India is taking its claim to be among the countries on the high table of international politics, it will have to employ innovative diplomatic strategies to tackle emerging transboundary water issues. And that has to be framed in a regional and sub-regional shared development context, and not only bilateral between two countries only, often with India playing the upper hand. Therefore, I have proposed this concept of river regionalism, that what we have asked actually. I have proposed this concept of river regionalism borrowing from the definition of political regionalism. So, and this river regionalism can be defined as referring to integral formations of transnational government and policy networks, the expression of shared political, economic, and development interests among the basin riparians and stakeholders, advancement in policy coordination and policy enterprises, and the creation of regional level institutions, which are very important to manage the common river basin interest. So the operationalization of this river regionalism in South Asia is therefore attempted through this analysis of the challenges and prospects of regional water cooperation through sub-regional initiatives which are already existing in South Asia. So the ability, for example, to comprehend the language of transboundary water cooperation by the regional and sub-regional initiatives such as the BCIM, the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar initiative, the BIMSTEC initiative, the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, BBIN initiative, and the SASEC, the initiative, lies at the core of such understanding. And if such issues resonate with the larger generative grammar of regionalism and sub-regionalism integration regimes in South Asia, then we will be able to make progress in linking such issues of transboundary water management to the larger economic regionalism agenda in South Asia. So in that context, transboundary water issues do find mention in South Asian sub-regional and regional cooperation agendas, but in very narrow terms of energy cooperation, for example, which includes primarily hydropower development and inland water in transport, for example, which falls under the larger connectivity and economic development imperatives of these processes. So the strategic resource framing of transboundary waters by the respective nation states in South Asia makes for a limited view of sub-regional and regional cooperation on transboundary water issues, actually. So this limited view bypasses the larger issue linkages to agriculture, livelihood, ecology, biodiversity, wetland connectivity, pollution concerns that have not been seen in the larger cooperative regional assessments in South Asia on a transboundary scale. So there is this evidence that we see of a clear lag of political agenda setting on transboundary water issues by the nation states, on sub-regional and regional cooperation initiatives. And this emanates, actually, this comes from a narrow bounded strategic framing and a securitized mindset with little space to such ecological framing. So we need to basically give this space to ecological framings, where the ecological benefits of such cooperation on transboundary rivers in South Asia, they are closely tied, to my mind, with the understanding of the interconnectedness of the larger Himalayan ecology, the shared geographical context, upon which the premise of sub-regional cooperation initiatives in South Asia are also based. So the mapping of sub-regional initiatives in South Asia provides evidence that ecological and environmental issues such as biodiversity, climate change, disaster management, and even water issues have been included at various points of time, but cooperation has been limited in nature. So in that context, the framing of ecological benefits of cooperation, such as tackling water quality issues, tackling water pollution, improving biodiversity, soil conservation, erosion protection, hydrological data sharing to reduce disasters that we see often nowadays, wetland conservation, and the overall sustainability issues are critical to bringing an alternative language of regional cooperation in South Asia, making it inclusive in character, plural in character, and enlarging the regional pie towards benefit sharing. So if we look at the economic benefits, that effectively is framed through, in context of transboundary rivers in South Asia, that understanding, it is based on that understanding that historically civilizations who have not understood or managed water issues better or well have effectively missed the bus of economic development. The mapping of the sub-regional initiatives in South Asia through river regionalism provides evidence that the economic complementarities of water resources management, albeit for even if it is in limited terms of hydropower development and inland water navigation, they are already present, but there is a greater need to build upon these existing economic synergies and to provide new entry points to the sub-regional cooperation agenda, which clearly underlines the economic cost of non-cooperation on transboundary rivers in South Asia. This approach synthesizes a regional agenda of economic realism connected to benefit sharing and sustainability aspects of transboundary water management, agricultural productivity, tackling floods, droughts, and climate change, benefiting South Asia through a larger process of river regionalism. So, to my mind, the steps that need to be taken is that a credible research-backed focus on a consortium of issues not seen as politically linked with transboundary rivers, such as environment, livelihood, biodiversity, climate change, disaster risk reduction, transboundary ecology. All of these can help generate a desecuritized sub-regional grammar spirit of transboundary water regional, transboundary water cooperation. So this is, in a sense, the synthesis of the idea of river regionalism. So in that sense, mechanisms which can be supplemented from the progress of already existing multilateral research and dialogue processes on economic integration. So we need to basically connect the ecological with the economic integration. And looking at examples from the region, if we look at the Mekong spirit, which is in the Mekong River Basin countries, lower Mekong River Basin countries, highlights the history of regional hydropolitics among the lower Mekong countries, deepening and widening cooperation also in the economic front. So the question to ask ourselves is that can the adoption of this informal code of conduct in regional processes, such as the norms, procedures, principles, within a possible, for example, the Brahmaputra spirit, can the Mekong spirit be brought into something like a Brahmaputra spirit framework that increases cooperation and promote flows, ensuring collective responsibility for riparian countries involved of the Brahmaputra River Basin, which are China, India, Bhutan, and Bangladesh. So this is an example of a roadmap ahead for South Asia to regionally appraise the bilateral gains of the past that we have seen in economic terms, and then bring it forward towards ecological kind of connectivities and understanding of transboundary rivers to be effective markers of this linking the regional architecture, so to say. Thank you.
Now, thank you for that answer, Dr. Mirza. It is an innovative proposal, and those in the audience who would want to further read upon this, the link to Dr. Mirza's paper is provided in the description section given below. Now, our next question for you is that you have undertaken a field research trip along the India-Bangladesh border, including the less researched part of the Meghalayan border, in which you have examined the informal market and the trade flows that exist there. Now, this would be a two-part question. First, what are the points to keep in mind while traveling and doing fieldwork along the Indo-Bangla border? And secondly, can you also share with us the crux of your findings from this research?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting two-part question. I will try to address it. The India-Bangladesh border is one of the longest land borders that India shares with its neighboring countries. And from east to west, as it makes a circuitous turn around the Siliguri corridor, or the chicken snack as it is known very popularly in strategic circles. It is intensely diverse in terms of its terrain and as well as in the composition of its borderland communities. Myself, along with my co-author, Edward Boyle, who is from Japan, have traveled in these borderlands, not in just one single field trip, but undertaken several field trips over the past few years across several sections of the India-Bangladesh border. And we have focused more on the eastern section of that border in Assam, Meghalaya, and Tripura, and which is interspersed with several informal border markets and formal border huts. The iterated engagement that we have to fieldwork methodology that we have developed along these borders enables us to unravel several layers of understandings and context over our many visits, underlined by the long duty engagement of communities along these borders and the flows of goods and commodities, be through that, these flows, maybe they could be through trucks, through in major crossings such as Dauki, or in the Akhora border in Tripura, or in headloads in the other informal crossings. So as researchers in the field of border studies, we have also made this long duty engagement with borderland communities as part of our fieldwork methodology. And in order to be able to do meaningful research and be sensitive participant observers. Sometimes when you simply go, for example, fishing with the community youth members, or go to these borderland areas during where the villagers are harvesting pineapples, or going to the betel nut farms to harvest the betel nuts and oranges in the farms, dotting along these India-Bangladesh borders, you end up learning more than merely by going to with structured questionnaires to these border huts or formal markets. It is not only true of this India-Bangladesh border, but also of the India-Myanmar borderlands, the India-Bhutan borderlands, and the Sino-Indian borderlands, where borderland communities navigate in their own unique ways the multiple securitized framings of the nation state effectively, while at the same time being cognizant of the nation state's sovereignty. So It is their contextualized perception of the borderlines that mark the territory between nation states, bypassing the state anxieties of control and ensuring that traditional border flows continue. And they have been doing so over the decades. Excuse me. The local communities inhabiting these borderlands in Northeast India, to my mind, are uniquely positioned to serve as strong cultural connectors in any future regional connectivity architecture within India's neighborhood diplomacy. In this context, I use the term cultural connectors to describe cultural drivers at the borderlands, which can contribute towards enhancing the content of public diplomacy by nation states across the international borders. And such public diplomacy is made in New Delhi, or made in Dhaka, or made in Thimphu, or in other state and national capitals. But the long duty engagement that I was talking about earlier of communities to flows and engagements across this borderline can actually be the crux of this kind of, how these cultural connectors, the communities being cultural connectors, enhancing this content of public diplomacy. Some examples of cultural drivers are ethnic communalities and shared cultural worldviews and aspirations of connectivity across national and international borders that communities have. Cultural connectors lays emphasis on this kind of shared, soft cultural frames of reference, as opposed to the hard, securitized, and strategic frames of reference that usually define exchanges and interactions across nation-state borders. So my research field trips have taken me to several of these cultural encounters across borders of Northeast India, where transboundary communities are able to effectively foster and maintain people-to-people connections over time. And we always maintain that people-to-people connections are the mainstay of regionalism and sub-regionalism to thrive in South Asia. And that is where we also need to work upon. The imagination and deployment of cultural connectors within the larger strategic and bilateral public diplomacy between nation states act as alternative catalysts. And this holds true of India's look or act east diplomacy. A number of cultural connectors in Northeast India are waiting to be tapped by India's neighborhood diplomacy in an innovative manner. This is, however, being plagued by an historical reluctance to trust local actors and traditional patterns of governance in Northeast India by several central agencies who are involved in border management. And that also to take an active part on these cultural connectors and borderland communities to be able to take an active part in India's foreign policy decision making, which needs rethinking to my mind. The nation state often looks at such borderland communities to be ordered over time so that they have complete control over the borderlands, and then take forward the goal of such control in terms of regional connectivity and trade. However, it is the borderland communities who can serve as the effective linkage of any meaningful connectivity, as evidenced by cordial relations across informal spaces over time along the many borders of Northeast India. And that has been there for decades. And if borderland communities are meant to be participating in such a regional transformation in South Asia, this has to be the way forward. The informal markets along this border that we have studied predate the formation of the modern nation states of India and Bangladesh, and signify local networks of exchange, flow of goods, community interactions, and negotiations across borders. The challenges faced by the sovereign state in dealing with and defining these fuzzy frames have to be seen in the context of the distinction between the perspectives concerning linear boundary markers and border fences, and of meandering borderlands and the meandering understandings of borderlands by borderland communities. The official border huts, which we popularly know as between India and Bangladesh, are an excellent case in point, where you essentially require a border fence first to be constructed across and along specific border pillars which are marked, and then regulate the fence through the construction of gates, which are then manned by the Border Security Force and the Indian Customs, and then opening it up to a border hut infrastructure. So this is an excellent illustration where the nation state first engages in ordering the constituent elements of its borderlands, which includes the communities, the flows, the linkages, through border fences and control, and then pierces the border fence at certain points and structures it and organizes it to make border huts. A fuzzy yet functional framing of the mobile border sits at the edges of the multiplicity of border layers between state anxieties of control, authority, and calculation of rigid fixed borders, and local community specificities inhabiting these meandering borderland spaces, while fully recognizing nation-state sovereignty, which I've already spoken about. In sense of these official securitized border huts, which are constructed in that manner by building a fence and then piercing it, are seen actually to be rupturing traditional informal market spaces and cross-border community interactions, making for sensitive spaces, exclusionary permit and regulatory systems which are put in place in border huts, and then otherwise bustling, vibrant market space, which the informal markets predating the border huts used to represent. The border huts are much like reinventing the wheel, which New Delhi has been successful in doing over and over again. So to say that they are much trumpeted by the nation state as being something innovative and original in terms of establishing connectivity between the communities on both sides of the borders of India and Bangladesh. The presence of the Border Security Force, the Indian Customs, and the gated fence openings are the bounded markers of state presence that can be termed as only original, which otherwise is a space of traditional cross-border flows. But the Indian state again comes into the focus, saying that we have made a breakthrough in terms of establishing border huts, while it is actually not. It is being seen as rupturing these traditional cross-border flows in the first place. So the crux of our research findings point to the exclusion of borderland communities from the processes of establishing border huts, which are supposedly designed to facilitate their development and welfare. A comparison between informal market spaces that used to exist earlier at the India-Bangladesh border and the official border huts demonstrate that the introduction of a permit system, which only a specific number of traders are allowed to access the border hut space, has severely limited the participation of communities who live and depend on these kind of markets, and they live right along the borderline. Many traders from faraway places, commercial centers away from the 5-kilometer radius of the borderline, which originally was sanctioned that border huts were only meant to serve a 5-kilometer radius of the borderline. These traders from faraway places and commercial towns get the permits to trade in these border huts. The items traded at the official border huts are not necessarily the ones which borderland communities within these 5 kilometers locally grow. The local produce, in fact, are traded at the informal border markets which still exist, where there are lesser restrictions and accessible to the larger market network, which is interlinked to other markets further inland from the borderline, making for an organic connectivity based on interdependencies that we see in these India-Bangladesh borderlands. Thank you.
Thank you for that informative answer, Dr. Mirza. Now, last question for you is what would be your suggestions to researchers who work or intend to work on the northeastern borderlands? And secondly, to also to travelers who want to visit these border regions?
Oh, that's a very interesting distinction that you make within the question of being researchers and travelers. Yeah, the borderlands of Northeast India have always drawn researchers and travelers from various parts of the country and the world across academic disciplinary backgrounds, maybe, and also different travel interests. This has led to a loose collation of an evolving and experiential resource methodology and engagement ethics in the sensitive borderlands of Northeast India. My understanding is that any researcher or traveler engaged in Northeast India will do well to have a long duty engagement with the region instead of the much often seen parachute engagement strategy, parachuting in and moving out. That kind of engagement strategy is short-sighted and will not work in a context. It might work for some, but in context of what I look at in terms of the long duty engagement, researchers, I would encourage researchers to be able to do that kind of a long duty engagement. And institutions such as universities and research institutes in different parts of India and also from different parts of the world should be able to commit resources to be able to make researchers travel and spend that amount of fieldwork time in India's own borderland regions. They may not be only in Northeast India, but they may be other parts of other border regions of India. But to be able to spend time, as I was able to do during my initial research days 15 years back, that is quite a lot of experience that will hold good for future research work and engagements. So I feel that there should be enough scholarships and resources allocated for such engagement to be possible. And I'm sure that there's already some things are happening, and it will continue to do so. And the importance of sustained engagement are reflected upon the ways that such research can have a meaningful impact, not just on the larger academic field of border studies, but also on the everyday lives of borderland communities living across Northeast India. The focus should also be on a grassroots-based bottom-up approach to issues, rather than to be jacketed in strategic dimensions alone. So the researchers will also do well to be able to remain engaged to the field areas and to the communities that they engage with. The aspect of travelers that you point out in such sensitive borderlands is also a very interesting one. We often see popular narratives of travelers being able to ride their motorcycles across the borderlands of Northeast India and move through the continental route connecting South Asia and Southeast Asia. I have seen multiple movies, more particularly in the Malayalam movie circuit. I think a lot of travelers who think of Northeast India as a very good connectivity kind of landmass to go through Southeast Asia. So, but on the ground, things are a bit more difficult to actually be able to. The borders are not so open as they think to be, or they depict in these movies to be. But again, the imagination of being able to traverse across this landmass and the aspirations of connectivity is in the both of the minds of these travelers that I was talking about, and also that is outside these borderlands, and also they are also in the minds of the borderland communities of the region itself. There are also travelers of the other kind of, like what we call as the car rally travelers, of industry leaders, bureaucrats, politicians, some top-notch think tankers who have held successive transboundary car rallies like the ASEAN car rally, the the Kunming car rally, marking out the connectivity between South Asia and Southeast Asia and East Asia. Such grand car rallies are detached from the borderland communities and are often very, very mere token connectivity markers. I have had the experience of being witness to one of these India ASEAN car rallies where school children in Assam were brought out to the sides of the roads and were given some random flags to be holding and waving at the passing cars, which did not even bother to stop at this to meet the school children, who were waving these flags. And upon looking at these flags, they were not even those flags which were of the ASEAN countries. They were just some random colorful flags which can be taken from the market. So in that context, I was saying that this connect of this grand car rallies, and this car rally also was followed by a helicopter on top with increased police protection. It was kind of a sanitized kind of a route that was given to this car rally to go, and very, very important sounding car rally, which again is disconnected from the ground. So the core perception of borderland communities, of these borderland, of these borders and mobility that these things depict, are sidelined by these kind of connectivity discourses. So in context of what if we think of borderland tourism, that has also boomed in recent times, with travelers from around the world descending upon Northeast India. There are core concerns of sustainable and responsible tourism practices amongst the borderlands, especially during these COVID times, where communities have been affected by COVID due to opening up of tourism to these places such as Meghalaya, Nagaland, remote villages of Mizoram and Manipur, and also in Arunachal Pradesh. Now they are suffering in this second wave because between the first wave and the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of tourism that happened in these areas. So there are certain core concerns of this kind of the tourism model that is being followed in Northeast India, and unchecked levels of tourism demands can cause additional layers of conflict in such areas, which will mostly be social and ecological in nature. For example, I will give you an example of these 6 Thai groups which inhabit large parts of Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, especially the Thai Khamti, the Thai Phake, and the Singpho communities. They speak about their extended family connections across the border in Myanmar and their inability to visit them. They say that if you have connectivity projects such as the Trans-Asian Highway or the Trans-Arunachal Highway within Northeast India, within Arunachal Pradesh, for example, those do not serve their cultural connectivity aspirations until it also links them with northern Myanmar through the Steel Well Road. The Pangsao Pass Winter Festival, which is held often every year now, but in some of these years it was not being able to help due to certain reasons, demonstrates strong cultural links across the region with various communities, underlining these open borders for more people-to-people exchanges. So the future pathways, if we come back into researching such transboundary spaces, have to imitate the natural geography of these very spaces in the context of Northeast India and its proximate international neighborhood. This is possible only through the deployment of alternative ecological framings of looking at the dominant development indicators deployed in the region, such as connectivity, regionalism, and sub-regionalism. The unpacking and tracing continuities and discontinuities of transboundary spaces, rivers, wetlands, forests, and mountains across international political, economic, social, and ecological geographies is a key pointer towards future research on Northeast India. The ability to integrate traditional knowledge systems and ecological understandings of communities to be able to inform modern governance models will be core to future research as well. In addition, the frames of eco-regionalism and bioregionalism will act as holistic grounders to the research agendas and not to keep it within a limited, narrow containers or the understanding of borders. So whatever has happened in terms of connectivity or infrastructure development in Northeast India has more or less remained within the nation state box. In order to be able to such connectivity and infrastructure to be able to be meaningful to communities in the region, in Northeast India particularly, that has to be also opened up meaningfully. It cannot remain within the nation state box forever. And that also has to be looked upon while we actually create this physical infrastructure. And along with this physical infrastructure, it is also important that the people of Northeast India also have this simultaneous social and social infrastructure needs of these communities be also kept in mind, so that they be able to participate in the regionalism kind of grand regional opening up that we envisage through opening up of borders in the region. Thank you.
Now, thank you, Dr. Mirza, for that answer, and also for being a part of the Sarat Samvad series. Your views and your opinions and the way that you brought out the Northeast to the audience is quite informative and something that is quite missing within the, what you could say, the border studies within South Asia and within the world itself.
Thank you so much, Ankur, for also taking the time for hosting me, and also meticulously, framing those questions which actually elicited these responses, and made me think in different ways. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Mirza.